Reddit, what secret did a stranger reveal that still keeps you up at night? The train's interior groaned with age, each flicker of the fluorescent lights overhead pulsing like the faltering heartbeat of a dying beast. It was one of those late-night rides where time thickened, stretching every second into a yawning eternity. Outside, the windows were mirrors of obsidian, offering no view but my own reflection cast in pale blue shadows. The seats were mostly empty, save for a snoring drunk 2 rows down and the man who sat directly across from me, angled awkwardly, legs jittering, fingernails shredded by the nervous grinding of his teeth. He wore a trench coat 2 decades out of style and reeked of earth, rain, and something faintly metallic, like rust, but sharper, acrid in a way that clawed at the back of the throat. His eyes were sunken wells of sleeplessness, hollowed to the bone, ringed in a grime that could not be washed away by mere water. He muttered to himself, voice low and erratic, as though arguing with a presence only he could see. I might have ignored him, chalked it up to the usual urban detritus of a public transit system, had he not gone silent so suddenly. He turned toward me, and it was like watching a puppet jerk to life on tangled strings. His neck cracked with the motion. Then, voice threadbare and eerily polite, he asked, "Do you believe in karma?" There was a long pause as my mind scrambled for a response, caught between politeness and the primal instinct to move away. I opened my mouth, some neutral sound forming in the back of my throat, but before I could shape it, he leaned in closer. His breath was warm and wet, and the scent of it was unbearable, like meat left too long in the sun. 10 years ago, he said, eyes locking with mine in a way that turned the moment heavy with invisible weight. I buried something under a tree behind a house that isn't mine. My breath caught, mouth drying to sand. I think it's still there, he continued, and his voice dropped lower, coated with something raw. Regret? Hope? Dread. Sometimes I still hear it scratching. He smiled then, a ghastly contortion of lips and teeth that pretended to be human comfort, but radiated only the macabre joy of someone who has learned to live with their nightmares. And then, as if his confession had lightened his load, he stood. The train screeched to a halt at the next minor station, a forgotten platform in a half-dead town I didn't catch the name of. He stepped off without luggage, without a backwards glance, his silhouette swallowed by the darkness like he'd always belonged there. I sat motionless for the rest of the journey, trying to rationalize it. Urban madness. A man unhinged, murmuring fictions. And yet something in the delivery, his voice, the timing, the exactness of it, unsettled a part of me I hadn't known was vulnerable. It didn't feel like a story. It felt like an infection. Weeks passed. I tried to let it fade, convinced myself it had been a meaningless encounter. But the phrase, "I think it's still there," kept circling in my mind like a vulture with nowhere else to feed. When I closed my eyes, I could hear the scrape, the imaginary scratching beneath soil, like fingers clawing upward through earth that would not give. Eventually, curiosity became compulsion. I retraced the train route, found the stop, asked questions no sane person should ask at a corner store with yellowed windows and a cashier who didn't blink enough. Found the street, Wisteria Lane, its name deceptively pretty, homes leaning with subtle neglect, peeling paint, overgrown lawns, the scent of mold clinging to the air like a persistent ghost. Then, the house. It looked like it hadn't been lived in for years, though a plastic swing still hung from a branch in the backyard, twisting slowly even though there was no wind. I circled behind it and found the tree, an ancient elm, its bark grooved like old skin. The ground beneath it had been disturbed, too recently for comfort. The soil was uneven, broken, as if something had been buried, then remembered, then visited again. I dug with my hands, nails breaking, the smell of rot rising with every handful. Not far beneath the surface, I found it. A toy. A small plastic dinosaur, its paint flaked and faded, one googly eye missing. Its presence was innocuous, even pathetic, and yet I felt as if I'd just pulled a relic from a grave. Then I saw the drag marks, long indentations in the dirt, as if something, or someone, had been pulled away from the tree. The marks vanished near the edge of a rusted fence, but their implication lingered. They were deliberate, spaced too evenly for the erratic scuffle of wildlife. I didn't call the authorities. couldn't. How does one explain chasing the whisper of a madman, of following the trail of a cryptic message delivered in the half-light of a derelict train? No, I kept it. All of it. Locked behind my teeth like a prayer I was too afraid to offer. Sleep has been a broken concept ever since. Not because of nightmares, but because silence is now unbearable. I have to sleep with noise, TVs, fans, radios, because if the room gets too quiet, then I hear it again. The scratching, not constant. Just enough to remind me it hasn't stopped. Just enough to suggest it knows I came. I've returned to the tree 3 times now. I don't dig anymore. I just stand there, watching, listening. Once, I found a new toy, different from the last. A stuffed rabbit this time, sodden and half-rotted, but unmistakably fresh. Someone has been tending to it. Someone else knows. I told myself not to go back. Not again. Not after the 3rd visit, when I'd stood in the half-shadow of that rotting elm, staring at the dirt like it might blink first. But there's something about unfinished things, about half-told stories and unsealed graves, that presses against the brain like water against glass. Pressure builds. Eventually, something breaks. And so, 5 days after my last silent pilgrimage, I returned. This time I brought a flashlight, a shovel, and a notepad filled with questions I was too afraid to ask aloud. The house still slouched under its roof like a drunk passed out on the lawn. Windows boarded, one hanging loose from a rusted hinge, the front door sealed by neglect rather than nails. I hadn't dared step inside before, not when the backyard had already offered more than I was willing to carry. But tonight, the air felt different, thicker, as if something inside the house had noticed me. I circled it slowly, steps light, crunching the brittle leaves underfoot like bones too old to protest. The tree greeted me as always, massive limbs reaching across the sky like it was trying to strangle the stars. The ground around it bore new signs, more disturbed earth and something stranger. Symbols, crudely drawn, faint, like someone had etched them into the dirt with their fingers or maybe a stick. Swirls, spirals, lines that bent back into themselves. They reminded me of something primal, something forgotten and forbidden. It looked like a child had played here, but no child I'd ever known drew shapes like these. Then I noticed the names. Just one at first, Eli, scrawled shakily into the soil, half covered by a fallen leaf. Then another, barely visible near the tree's roots, Hannah. The names weren't new. The earth had softened them, as though it had tried to swallow them again. There was no last name, no dates, just first names, like someone had wanted to remember, or confess. I didn't dig immediately. I sat down, leaning against the cold bark, flashlight dimmed to avoid drawing attention, though to whom I couldn't say. The air carried no wind, and yet I felt watched. Not by someone in the ordinary sense, but by the place itself, by the roots under my feet, by the house behind me, by the dark space between the trees that formed vague human shapes if you stared too long. For nearly an hour I waited. I listened. Nothing moved. But silence has a texture in places like this, thick as syrup, capable of holding echoes too old to speak. Eventually, the waiting became unbearable. I picked up the shovel and returned to the spot near the rabbit. The earth here had been freshly moved again. The grass hadn't even begun to reclaim it. I started digging, slowly, gently, like I was afraid to wake something. It didn't take long to reach something solid. Not wood, not metal, plastic. A small container, maybe a storage bin, like the kind used to hold Christmas decorations or old clothes. I pulled it free with effort, the handle slick with dampness and age. It was wrapped in plastic bags, bound with a cord of fraying rope that felt strangely ceremonial, knotted not for function, but for meaning. When I opened it, I expected bones. I expected photographs. I expected something terrible. What I found instead were more toys, dozens of them. Some broken, others pristine. All belonged to different eras. Plastic action figures from the 80s, cheap fast food collectibles from the 90s, wooden dolls that looked handmade, painted with meticulous care. Each toy had a name tag stuck to it. Torn masking tape, faded ink. Some names matched the ones I'd seen on the ground. Others were unfamiliar. And at the very bottom, wrapped in tissue that had long since turned to pulp, was a photo. A group of children, smiling, standing in front of the tree. The tree. There it was in the background, unmistakable in its twisted defiance of symmetry. The kids looked normal enough, happy even. But standing just behind them was a figure blurred not by motion, but by something else. Something wrong. As if the film itself had rejected that part of the image. I dropped the photo. For a moment, I was 11 years old again, alone in the attic of my grandmother's house, reading horror comics by flashlight, daring myself not to blink. That same feeling returned. Skin too tight, air too thin, the sense that the world had tilted in ways no adult ever warned you about. I left the toys. I reburied the box. I took only the photo. Back home, I pinned the picture to the wall and stared at it for hours. The figure behind the kids. It wasn't wearing anything modern. It looked older. Not just in fashion, but in essence. No eyes, no face, no features. Just a silhouette where something should have been. I scanned the image into my computer, tried running enhancement filters. Nothing. Every attempt made the distortion worse. The digital version broke apart, pixelating violently, as if the file itself was protesting. I printed it anyway, pinned it above my bed, and every night since I've had the same dream. I'm one of the children in the photo. I'm standing in front of the tree, and the figure behind me moves. Closer, always closer, until I feel its breath, wet, rattling, cold as soil. The worst part isn't the dream. It's what happens when I wake. Because each morning, without fail, the photo is changed. The group of children grows by one, and I can confirm 100% that the new face looks like me. I didn't return to the tree again. Not at first. Not after the photo began to change. Each morning I'd wake to find another child added. New posture, new smile, but the same haunted hollowness behind their eyes. They weren't digital artifacts. These were faces etched with too much detail, too much personality to be products of glitch or trickery. The image had a life of its own now, and I no longer doubted that something within it was watching me. By the time the sixth child appeared, I stopped sleeping altogether. My apartment grew colder, rooms filled with the sort of shadows that don't care whether the lights are on or off. I caught glimpses in the corners. Short figures, unmoving, always just behind where I was looking. I stopped checking mirrors after I saw one standing next to me in the reflection and not beside me in the room. I was unraveling, days smeared together. My thoughts swam in spirals. But beneath the fear, beneath the noise, one question stuck to me like a nail in the soul of my mind. What did the man on the train want? He hadn't told me to find the house. He hadn't asked for help. He confessed, whispered it like a warning, or an invitation, and I'd accept it. Whether I knew it or not, by stepping onto that rotted ground, by digging, by touching what should have remained hidden, I had answered his question. I did believe in karma, and now, something old, something buried long before me, believed in me. The morning I found my name on the photo was the morning I stopped pretending I could walk away. There, scrawled in faint blue ink across the bottom corner, just beneath my growing likeness, Daniel. That was all it took. A name, a signature. And suddenly, I wasn't a bystander anymore. I was part of it. Bound. I returned to the house for the last time, not with tools or questions, but with a box of matches and a gas canister stolen from the maintenance closet in my building's basement. The wind had returned that day, and with it came a sound I hadn't heard since childhood. The rustling of leaves as voices, whispers that didn't need language to be understood. The tree was waiting. I stood before the elm as dusk pulled a bruise-colored sky over the horizon. The air was thick with scent, wet earth, burnt rubber, and beneath it all, the faint copper tang of blood. This time, I didn't go to the spot where the toys had been buried. I went to the roots. Digging by hand, fingers stiff from the cold, I uncovered something hard. Not plastic. Not a container. A lid. A wooden hatch, buried beneath tangled roots that had grown around it like protective arms. It took everything I had to lift it. The hinges groaned like they hadn't been moved in decades. Beneath it was a staircase, narrow and crude, carved into the earth itself, the descent swallowed in perfect blackness. The moment I saw it, I knew. This was what the man had buried, not a body. A door. I descended. The air down there was wet, warm, and buzzing, not with sound but with pressure, like the hum of an enormous machine idling somewhere below. The walls of the tunnel were smooth, polished with age, the kind of stone that bore no marks of tool or hand. Only one light source pierced the dark, a lantern, old and oil-fueled, standing at the far end beside what looked like a shrine. It was simple, stones stacked in a triangle, bones arranged with deliberate care around it, and in the center sat the photo, the original, not printed, not digital, an old Polaroid with curled edges, speckled with mold. The children were all there, all but one. The figure. It was gone. In its place, the background shimmered, warped, and slowly, as if materializing from beneath the surface of the film itself, something began to form. Not a body, not a face, a shape. Ancient. Wrong. A curve where there should have been angles. Eyes that didn't look but devoured. It was coming through the photo. Or maybe the photo was always a doorway. And then I heard them. Footsteps. Not behind me. Below me. Beneath the floor. Scratching. Scraping. Climbing. There was no more time. I soaked the shrine in gasoline, letting it run over the bones, the photo, the lantern. I struck the match. The flame bloomed instantly, a flower of fire spreading through the cavern, licking the walls with ravenous hunger. I turned and ran, the fire chasing me up the stairs, smoke curling into my lungs, filling my ears with the roar of something ancient screaming in rage. I made it out just as the hatch blew open behind me, a geyser of smoke and fire vomiting skyward through the tangled limbs of the elm. The tree ignited. The house followed. Everything burned. The sky turned the color of rusted pennies. Ash fell like snow. I stood there until the roof collapsed inward, and the tree split with a thunderous crack, sending charred limbs to the ground like a dying beast surrendering to gravity. I didn't feel relief. I didn't feel anything. I walked away. In the weeks that followed, I kept expecting to see the photo again, on my wall, on my doorstep, in my dreams. But it never returned. The scratching stopped. No more children, no more whispers, no more names. I sleep now, restlessly, but without terror. And in the rare moments I dream, they are quiet. Empty places, featureless, without trees or houses or buried things. I still ride the train sometimes, late at night, hoping I might see him again. The man, the stranger who started it all. But he never returns. And maybe that's the point. Maybe, like me, he'd been given a task, a burden passed down through whispers in the dark. And once I took it from him, he was finally free. Now I am the one who carries the secret. Now I am the one who waits. But if anyone ever asks me on a lonely train, in the dead of night, if I believe in karma, I'll smile, and I'll lean in close, and I'll say, 10 years ago, I buried something under a tree behind a house that isn't mine, and I'll let them decide what they want to do with that. Because the door may be closed, but something is always waiting on the other side.